You've just had, I asked Craig for some stats, 400 abstracts, 88 orals, 80 tabletops, 108 posters, 48 lightnings, which are short 5-minute pieces, to 560 of you delegates. So, it's probably no shock to you that Rachel and I didn't get to cover all of those. We're starting with a disclaimer that what follows is a subjective, biased and random account of what happened, of what was said at the 2017 IAYMH conference. We were told we had to be funny, so we're both kind of serious, so we don't really have any jokes, but so we struggled, and Rachel, you came up with one thing that was kind of funny. Yeah, go on.
It's quite a bit of pressure now, really. You'll have to laugh, so please pretend it's funny, even if it isn't. So I had an observation that in the last few minutes of this conference, if you're with someone and you haven't yet worked out what they do, take them in the elevator, make them do an elevator pitch, and then leave. You're done. That's it. That's all you need to do to hear your stories from people. Just make them do a very fast, 30-second elevator pitch, and you're done.
There you go.
Thank you for the laugh. That was kind.
Well, my funny moment was that some of you know, Bill Whelan was here yesterday morning, and he came at 7 o'clock, and we met in the lobby for coffee, and he really needed a coffee, and I said, have a coffee, and we sat down for coffee, and then he came to pay for the coffee, and I realized I had no money, and the lady wouldn't let me pay on account because I couldn't tell her what room I was in because I wasn't in a room, and Bill's looking at me, and I had to kind of go fluff it in his pocket and find change, which he'd bought for parking, because he also had to pay for that. But it was kind of funny and broke the ice. Anyway, what did we think about this conference? What do you think?
So before we get going, I kind of want to acknowledge how quite a lot of us might be kind of overwhelmed by the number of ideas that are here. I was speaking to someone just before I went on, and they were saying to me that, are you drained as well? Like, are you tired? Has your brain been overwhelmed by all this information? And I just wanted to sort of thank everybody for being here and sharing that information, and just kind of acknowledge that you might go away feeling a bit tired, and that's okay. So just to kind of thank everybody for what they've been sharing. But we're going to talk a bit about some of the key themes that we've come across during the session. Tony?
Well, I think overall I found this a much nicer conference. No, I didn't. Sorry, I said that. We're going to start again. I have to say that the conference in Montreal was a much nicer conference than this one, because Canadians are more polite people. And it struck me at the end of that conference that we'd all agreed with one another about everything. We gave each other massive claps on the back, and we echoed each other's achievements. And something different happened here. I think it's because you're in Ireland, and we fight with each other all the time. We can't agree on anything, except marriage equality. We did get that one right, but you're in a different country, and I think if mental health is anything, it's about balancing tensions and contradictions. And I think if a mental health association is real, it has to be able to hold tensions and contradictions. And I think that something is happening in our brain as an organization, and we are maturing, and it is that we're able to have differences and engage in those around mental health. And it's not that one side is right or wrong, it's not that way at all. It's that there's sort of dialectics between biological, between social, and so on. But we've been able to, I've seen some of these played out in intense but real conversations. Is that fair enough, would you?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. So I'm going to talk a bit about how mental health is social. So that's come across in a lot of the presentations that we've seen across the conference. So here I get to be a bit serious, which I'm better at, so This is easy. So one aspect of it is it being social between people and how people can support one another, and one is the broader social context. So in terms of it being social between people, someone in a session I was in earlier said that resilience is no fun if you have no one to share it with, to share that journey with. Batman was resilient, and he had Robin, and also the Justice League. So you've got to think about how we aren't individuals, we're not in isolation. I think that kind of is shown here today, so we can collaborate with one another. It's also about thinking about the social determinants of mental health, and I'm really thankful that the last 3 speakers spoke about that quite predominantly. It was really, really great to hear from such great people. So what we've been thinking about, it's not about always what is happening between your ears. It's about, in your brain, although that's important, it's about what's happening in the world around you. So we can all take on advocacy roles and go forward to try and change not just the services that someone gets to when they're in a crisis or when they're getting support, but actually the life that they're living in and how that contributes to how they are as a person.
Yeah, I think that there's been a shift from, mental health, ill health as a sort of a very subjective individual issue to being something that is lived out. It's about what's happening, not so much between people's ears, but what's happening between them and their world. And this morning was very moving to hear Mina and others talk about the kind of cultural determinants of mental health, but also the social experiences people have of injustice, of discrimination, of poverty, of exclusion. And Faye and others also just talking about these realities that don't just result from somebody's ill health, but actually create some of those realities. And it's something about just widening the lens, and I think we all know that. But I felt that was a big shift, and I felt that we moved to thinking about young people as in a much more inclusive way, and that was important. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that has come up quite a lot that I've observed is us thinking about prevention or intervention and what stage are we going to step in. We've talked a lot about services, and a lot of the conversations have been about the barriers to accessing those services and about the delivery of those services and about young people being involved in those services. But in a previous panel discussion that I was in, someone said, well, what about when it's not a service? What about when it's delivered to people where they are? What about when it's delivered between people? So we need to bring focus not just to service development, but to challenging ways that we can deliver change in environments that work for young people. And at the forefront of that is young people being central to the delivery and to creating those things. So ways that can happen is whole approaches, so looking at your whole community, and so many of you are doing this, and it's incredible. You're partnering with people that exist in your communities and doing great, great work there.
And I think prevention is tricky. It's harder to get a handle on. It's less easy to measure. And so intervention is always slightly more sexy, slightly more tangible. And I think that but most of mental health is supported, most of young people in young people's lives is supported through informal structures that are in their lives, people, relationships that just are transformative in their lives, peers. And these people, these good adults in people's lives are people who need to be valued, acknowledged, supported within schools, within youth organisations, within sports clubs, but they're essential, and somehow we need to be able to include them in our thinking rather than just wait until the proverbial hits the fan and then we intervene, which is also important, but it's not the only thing.
And another area that all the young people here have been amazing at championing is participation. So on the Sunday, I spent the first day in the research workshop, and they gave us a challenge there of how can you take your work from involving youth in one way up to the next level. And this isn't about going from not involving youth at all to involving them in employing them as full-time staff, for example. But it's taking you up from one step to the other in a way that works, and in consulting youth even in taking those steps. So I think as mental health practitioners and people who understand mental health, we all know that listening is a very good therapeutic tool. It works to help people to get better, and it works to help people manage their mental health. But why don't we use that in our services? Why don't we use that in the delivery and the kind of strategy behind everything? We need to kind of ask questions and listen to one another. And I think everyone here is doing that here and across all the different sessions.
Well, I do think that it was a good point made last night by one of the speakers in the hypothetical, I was going to say the proverbial, the hypothetical. And he said, we talk about youth participation, but it's not happening in a lot of places. And I think we need to remember that it's marvellous where it is happening, because something happens to us when we listen deeply to what the actual lived experience of young people is like. I mean, we've had so many examples throughout the conference. Lisa yesterday brought us right back to Heel in her very eloquent account of her own experience. And that is, it changes how we think and ultimately how we behave in developing our services. So that voice is very important, but also the voice of young people, not only as the beneficiaries of care, giving us feedback, but the active designers of services and policies and research, so that they actually are leading rather than just helping us. Mm.
Yeah.
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 I thought you were going to say that one.
Yeah. So many people here are doing fantastic research, but as Barbara touched on, there's some sort of dissatisfaction between where academic research is translating into practice. And as someone who works in policy, I'd like to kind of offer out a hand to say, just tell us what you're doing, make it communicatable. In the research workshop, there were young people there from Origin who work on translating research into something that young people can really digest, and I think that's really key, and places like this are perfect for that. So this is why Twitter's great. You can tell us what you're doing in like 149 characters. Perfect.
I went to some great research papers, one by Max on an early detection of eating disorders and the risks, so that we can really go upstream and intervene earlier, and that was very practical. But very often the criticism was made that the gap between academia and practice is huge, and it has to be crossed. Another paper was marvellous, was on exercise and depression, and just how simple but important that is. But again, it's not the exercise that seems to be just the thing. It's the fact that the therapist believes in that and embodies that and is doing that seems to affect change. So again, it's just these are really interesting. Today we had some examples of research that just I want to come back to Mario's research because it was fantastic. And the problem is we had written our notes before we came to this session, so this is messed up things. We had 3 amazing papers and we want to do justice to those 2. But I think the other thing is that people have talked about evidence-based practice, and there's a certain veneration of that. And of course there should be, because we know when you move from tightly controlled RCT settings into naturalistic settings that nearly 50% of the interventions work. So we should be delighted about that. Or should we? Anyway, the point is there's also practice-based evidence, and it was interesting this morning to hear some of the speakers from Jigsaw, which I have some familiarity, just talk about the learning, because what we're doing is tricky, it's messy, and we need to harness the learning, not just about what works, but what doesn't work. I always think an expert is somebody who knows what doesn't work, because that's gold, that's super knowledge, and we should always value that and allow it to happen. But it's so research. A lot of talk, and I think it was more dominant in other versions of this conference, and it's finding its place, but among other voices, and in a very interesting way, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I've seen that's really, really powerful is taking young people through a path and through a journey, from being someone who's interested in an issue from a personal perspective through to somebody who's able to research it. And also with that research capacity being imaginative and creative. So there's people from organisations across here who are doing really amazing work as young people, who really get that they can take their mental health journey and then they can find a role that is both important in the world but also interesting for them. And I think that has been really, really powerful to see speakers reflect on that as well.
The argument for technology is compelling. I mean, it's amazing, and it has woven its way throughout this entire conference. But, you know, it was really heartening to hear Mario's presentation, because one of the things that worried me was that there was a kind of almost an uncritical acceptance or glorification of technology, like it is the wonderful, it is the new thing, and we just adore it. But actually, we need to be very careful of what it's doing to us and what it's doing to young people. Technology and social media gave us Brexit via Cambridge Analytics. And one of their board members, a certain Steve Bannon, persuaded his buddy Donald to spend 12 million on Cambridge Analytics and gave us a Trump presidency. Big data is using data and shaping how we behave. And we need to get ahead of the curve and be aware of this and not just be, following it slavishly, because it's, that was missing from me until I heard Mario's talk. It's superb. Thank you so much for that. It's an enhancement, not a replacement, as somebody tweeted. And it can be, and it should be, and it's understanding it, and let's not talk like we understand it. We don't yet understand what's going on. Bill Whelan talked about music and technology and how it's changed the whole experience for musicians of making a livelihood, because streaming music has taken so much of possibility out of the system for them. So that's going to affect and change the lives of many artists who might not be artists, So let's keep ahead of that rather than just follow it. And thank you for the work you're doing. Oh yeah. So in conclusion, do you want to add anything on the research?
I think one thing on technology.
Yeah.
So I want to draw an analogy between technology and sex education in the US. May sound random, it is, but so is the internet.
Sure?
But my point is that in some states in America, there is a complete no sex rule. So we will not teach you sex education, and it is bad to have sex. And but we know from evidence that that does not work, because young people will still go out and they'll have uninformed consent in their sex. They will have unsafe sex. And the analogy I'm drawing here, although it may seem a little random, is that if we say to young people, don't use the internet, it's bad for your health, they're going to use it anyway. We saw the 100 clicks or whatever it is statistic. We are going to use the internet, just like most of us will probably have sex. So the point here is that what we need to do is equip young people with the tools to be informed about the internet, because it will change again and again, time after time. The apps will change every day, and the way we use it will change every day. So what we need to do is have critical thinking skills and be taught those in order to approach it, rather than just be told that it's bad for us, essentially. And I think that that's what the Origin project kind of taps into quite well, actually.
And so to our last, I think, theme that we picked up, which is around story. And I heard things like change is messy, change is incremental, little changes are important, very sobering. Change doesn't always work. And these are quotes, let's get real and start learning from our failures. Unless you're getting resistance, pushback, you're probably not doing what needs to be done. Pat McGarry. So the question is, what is the story we're telling now about youth mental health, and how is that different to the one we told in 2010 or 2015? And I think what we learned from Bill Whelan, particularly around music, was the need not to ever get, his language was strange, it was, don't get fixated on fixes or fixed on fixations, but not to think we've arrived at something that works and therefore we hold on to it desperately and we freeze dry it and we make it orthodoxy. It doesn't work like that. The story we had even in 2010 isn't big enough for the territory we're on now, so it has to keep changing. I think I want to just say a bit about this in an Irish thing, because I have to give you a bit of poetry, I think language is so important. And the language is one of the ways that we find mental health. Mental health is the ability to, it's a story we're able to tell, we're able to put into listening to, Natasha, sorry. You know, it's a story that can be told. Mental ill health perhaps is a story that cannot be told, it hasn't been told, you know. But the language we're using is so important. The language you used about, is this an immature brain or a brain that's maturing? That is a paradigm shift, and it completely blows your mind. It's language. And one of our great playwrights, Brian Friel, said that it can happen, quote, "It can happen that a civilization can become imprisoned in a linguistic contour that no longer matches the landscape of fact." A linguistic contour that no longer matches the landscape of fact. We need to watch our language, and you know, and as our story evolves. Now, the story is interesting because we also need to be able to go back to what we know. And I think the other thing I learned from Bill is that it was him reaching back into the deep well of his culture, our culture here, and drawing from that. And I think that the learning from that is that as you go back to your own particular community or culture or country, that you must also look back to what you have already got. Because it's there to be harnessed and reimagined or represented, but don't just ignore the past. But at the same time, we've got to move forward. Listening to Sworn. Yes, okay, yeah. You know, I think he just spoke so eloquently about some things that don't change, that young people need scaffolding. They need adults in their lives to help them to hold their hand as they make their way towards autonomy. That hasn't changed. Winnicott has said that and talked about everybody's need of a facilitating environment. Jigsaw has talked about one good adult and how that's one of the most strongest predictors we can find about mental health. So those things need to be held and cherished. But Bruce also said that while the building blocks of positive mental health remain somewhat the same, there are other things that are changing and changing fast. The supports, are computing power, the whole revolution in technology is just one example he used. But the supports that have been taken for granted in communities perhaps are not there as much anymore, or even in families, the stability people found. So people are finding themselves in new spaces where Bruce said the lines between their online and their offline existence have become blurred. And this is, again, a challenge to which we have to adapt. But so what's the new story? In 2006, when we started, Matt Hamilton for Headstrong had a phrase he used which was very simple but very beautiful. You know, we're here to give hope, to bring hope to the conversation about youth mental health. Simple narrative, but very binding and very uniting. You know, in Montreal, there was a narrative last time from, I can't remember her name, the young person who spoke at the beginning. And she said, what we're really trying to do is to make sure that each person that we're concerned about, every young person has the equivalent of a good adult in their life, which could be a peer, that each person has that person in their lives that we needed when we were 17. You know, and that stayed with me. I think the story is moving now, as I listen to this conference, to something even more simple. But it's a story about that youth mental health, and wait for it, guys, is about young people. But it's about all young people. And we don't have all young people here. And it's very easy to forget those who are alienated, marginalised, excluded, all over the world and in Dublin City. So it's about all young people. But that's my take on the story. You might have a different one. And Rachel?
So what is the story that you're going to take home? And how might you change what you do in light of that story? Thank you.
Thank you.